March 3, 1989, Berkeley County, South Carolina. The morning air hung heavy with the kind of dampness that clings to skin in the low country, where Spanish moss drapes from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds. On Horseshoe Road in the small community of Cross Hill, just outside Monk's Corner, a 5-year-old boy named Justin Lee Turner should have been walking to his neighbor's house to catch the school bus. His stepmother, Pamela, later told police she wasn't feeling well that morning, that she'd been taking a shower instead of walking him to the bus stop like she normally did. She said Justin left the house alone, heading toward the neighbor's place just down the road. But Justin never arrived. The neighbor never saw him. The school bus left without him. And by 3 o'clock that afternoon, when Pamela called the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office to report her stepson missing, she told them a different story, that Justin had gotten on the bus that morning but never came home. 2 days later, on a Sunday morning filled with volunteers and search dogs, news cameras from Charleston's WCBD-TV captured something that would haunt this case for 35 years. Victor Lee Turner, Justin's father, opening the door to the family's camper trailer parked behind their house, stepping inside, and moments later, backing out with his face twisted in anguish, crying out, "My son's in there!" Inside a cabinet in that camper, searchers found Justin's small body. He had been strangled. Justin Lee Turner was born in 1984, a little boy with his whole life stretching out before him like an unopened gift. At 5 years old, he was exactly the kind of child you'd see in any small southern town. A boy who should have been collecting Lightning McQueen toys, learning to tie his shoes, making friends in kindergarten, coming home with finger paintings and scraped knees. He lived with his father, Victor, and his stepmother, Pamela, in a modest home on Horseshoe Road, a quiet stretch of Berkeley County where neighbors knew each other's names and children still played outside until the streetlights came on. Berkeley County, in 1989, was a place caught between worlds. Not quite. Charleston, with its historic cobblestones and tourist charm, but not quite country either. Monk's Corner, the county seat, had about 8,000 people back then. Cross Hill was even smaller, the kind of place where a missing child would mobilize an entire community within hours. Justin attended school in the Monk's Corner area, riding the bus like countless other children in rural South Carolina, where distances between homes meant that yellow school buses were as much a part of childhood as playground swings. Those who knew Justin remembered him as a typical 5-year-old, energetic, curious, still young enough that the world seemed mostly good and safe. He had his routines, his favorite foods, his small rituals that make up a child's daily life. On most mornings, Pamela would walk with him to the neighbor's house, where several children gathered to wait for the bus together. It was the kind of arrangement common in neighborhoods where parents looked out for each other's kids, where a quarter-mile walk between houses was nothing unusual, where trust still existed. But on the morning of March 3, 1989, something changed. Pamela would later tell investigators that she and Justin had argued that morning, though the specifics of that argument would remain frustratingly vague in police reports. She said she wasn't feeling well, that she'd decided to take a shower instead of walking him to the neighbors. She claimed Justin knew the way and had gone by himself. But the neighbor, a woman who had welcomed those children into her yard dozens of times before, never saw Justin that morning. Her own children confirmed it. The bus driver confirmed it. Justin Lee Turner never left his home on Horseshoe Road. And sometime between the early morning hours and 3 o'clock that afternoon, his short life ended. The morning of March 3, 1989, began like any other Friday in Berkeley County. Dawn broke slowly over the pine forests and palmetto scrub, the sky shifting from deep purple to pale gray before the sun finally burned through the morning mist. Inside the Turner home on Horseshoe Road, the rhythms of a school morning should have been unfolding. Breakfast, backpacks, the small negotiations between parent and child about wearing a jacket or remembering a lunchbox. But something was different that morning. In affidavits filed years later, investigators would reference an altercation between Pamela Turner and Justin, an argument whose details were never fully explained, but which would take on enormous significance as the case unfolded. What did a 5-year-old boy and his stepmother argue about? Was it something as ordinary as eating breakfast or getting dressed? Or was it something that escalated beyond what anyone could have anticipated? These questions would echo through 3.5 decades of investigation, never fully answered. Pamela's story was that she wasn't feeling well, that she needed to take a shower, that Justin, at 5 years old, knew the routine well enough to walk by himself to the neighbor's house just down the road. It was a reasonable enough explanation for a rural South Carolina morning in 1989, when children still had more independence than they would in later decades. But when investigators later pieced together the timeline, that story began to crumble like old paper. The neighbor, a woman who had welcomed the neighborhood children into her yard countless mornings, was certain Justin never appeared. She watched for him because that's what neighbors did. When the school bus pulled up at the designated time, Justin wasn't there. The bus driver marked him absent and continued the route. At school, Justin's desk remained empty. Teachers noted his absence. Hours passed. Morning became afternoon. And then, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 hours after Justin should have boarded the bus, 7 hours after the school day began, Pamela Turner called the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office to report her stepson missing. But the story she told the dispatcher wasn't that Justin had never made it to the bus stop. Instead, she said Justin had gotten on the bus that morning but never came home. It was a lie that would immediately unravel under the gentlest scrutiny, but it was the lie she told. Why would a mother, even a stepmother, claim her child had made it to school when he hadn't? What were those 6 hours between when Justin should have left for school and when she called police? What happened in that house on Horseshoe Road? Berkeley County Sheriff's deputies responded quickly. In a small community like Cross Hill, a missing 5-year-old triggered an immediate and massive response. Officers arrived at the Turner home to interview Victor and Pamela. Neighbors were questioned. The school was contacted. The bus driver was interviewed. And very quickly, the discrepancies in Pamela's story became impossible to ignore. No, the neighbors said. Justin never came to the house. No, the bus driver said. Justin never boarded. No, the school said. Justin never arrived, which meant Justin had never left home, which meant something had happened in that house, or on that property, or somewhere between the morning argument and the afternoon phone call. Somewhere in those lost hours, Justin Lee Turner had died. His small body would be found 2 days later, not miles away in some wooded area or abandoned building, but steps from his own back door, hidden inside a cabinet in the family camper, a place only someone intimately familiar with the property would know to look. Someone who had keys, someone who had access, someone who knew exactly where a small boy's body could be concealed. The search for Justin Turner began immediately on that Friday afternoon in March 1989, with deputies fanning out across the rural landscape of Berkeley County. Volunteers mobilized from churches and community centers. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers leading them through the pine forests and along the dirt roads that crisscrossed the area. In small southern communities like Cross Hill, when a child goes missing, the entire town responds. Mothers left their own children with relatives to join search parties. Men took off work. The local media arrived, cameras in tow, documenting what everyone hoped would be a story with a happy ending. A confused little boy found wandering, scared but unharmed. But even in those first hours, investigators from the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office felt something wasn't right. The lies were too obvious, too easily disproved. Pamela's claim that Justin had boarded the bus contradicted every witness account. And there was something else. Something that made veteran detectives' instincts prickle with suspicion. During those initial interviews at the Turner home, as search teams combed the surrounding area, Victor Turner asked a law enforcement officer a strange question. A According to affidavits filed decades later, Victor asked what would happen if someone had harmed the victim. Specifically, what would happen if that person was in the family? It was the kind of question that seems innocent on its surface, but haunts investigators afterward. Why would a father, in the midst of searching for his missing son, be thinking about consequences? Why would he be asking about family involvement before the child had even been found? The search continued through Friday night, through all day Saturday. News coverage intensified. UCBD-TV, the NBC affiliate from Charleston, sent a crew to document the search efforts. By Sunday morning, March 5th, dozens of volunteers had gathered at the Turner property, preparing for another day of searching. And that's when it happened. The moment that would be replayed on television screens for decades. The moment that would become both evidence and controversy. Grief and suspicion captured on videotape. Victor Turner walked out to the family's camper trailer, parked just behind the house on their property. The news cameras were rolling. He opened the camper door and stepped inside. Moments later, he backed out, his face contorted, crying out for everyone to hear. "My son's in there!" The camera captured his anguish, his collapse, his grief. Inside the camper, hidden in a cabinet, searchers found Justin's body. He had been there the entire time, mere steps from where his father and stepmother had been answering questions, accepting sympathy, participating in the search. Justin Lee Turner had been strangled, killed by what forensic pathologists identified as ligature strangulation, meaning a cord or rope-like object had been used to compress his neck until he died. The crime scene told a story that investigators immediately began to interpret as staged. Justin's body, his clothing, his shoes, none of them bore the dirt, debris, or vegetation you would expect if he had walked or been dragged outside. He was clean, suggesting he had been carried. The placement inside the cabinet wasn't random or panicked. It showed knowledge of the camper's layout, deliberate concealment. And the Turner family were the only ones with keys to that camper, the only ones with regular access. Most troubling to investigators was Victor's behavior. He hadn't searched the camper. He'd gone directly to it. He'd opened a specific cabinet. He hadn't called out Justin's name or checked if his son was breathing. He'd simply looked, backed away, and announced the discovery. To detectives, it looked like a performance, a staged discovery designed to create the appearance of innocence. The autopsy confirmed strangulation. Forensic pathologists estimated Justin had died sometime between the evening of March 2nd and the early morning of March 3rd, though pinpointing an exact time of death is always challenging with strangulation cases. Investigators collected evidence from the crime scene, fibers from Justin's clothing, samples from the camper, anything that might connect to a murder weapon. They focused on a ligature, described in some reports as a dog leash or collar, though this detail would become controversial decades later. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the parents. Who else had opportunity? Who else had access? Who else had lied about Justin's whereabouts? Within a year, in 1990, Pamela Turner was arrested and charged with murder. A grand jury indicted her, and it seemed the case was moving toward trial. But then, mysteriously, the charges were dropped. Prosecutors claimed insufficient evidence. Whatever they thought they had, whatever circumstantial case they'd built around the lies and the opportunity, apparently wasn't strong enough to take before a jury. Pamela was released, and the case went cold. Victor was never charged, his alibi of being at work apparently checking out. But the cloud of suspicion never lifted from either of them. For 31 years, the Justin Turner case sat in filing cabinets at the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office, one of thousands of unsolved cases that haunt law enforcement agencies across America. Pamela Turner changed her name to Megan Renee Turner, possibly to escape the stigma and the whispers that followed her. She and Victor moved out of state, trying to build lives under the weight of suspicion, unable to properly grieve their son because everyone assumed they had killed him. The community of Cross Hill slowly moved on, the way communities do, though older residents never forgot the little boy whose body was found in his family's camper. And as the years passed, as 1989 became 1995, became 2000, became 2010, it seemed increasingly likely that Justin's death would remain forever unsolved, his killer never brought to justice. Then, in April 2021, something changed. The Berkeley County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, a specialized team dedicated to reviewing unsolved crimes with fresh eyes and new technology, pulled the Justin Turner file from its decades-long sleep. Cold case units had become more common across American law enforcement in the 2000s and 2010s, driven by advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, that allowed investigators to solve cases that had been impossible to crack with 1980s and 1990s technology. The Justin Turner case seemed like a perfect candidate for such a review. Evidence still existed. Physical samples had been preserved, and forensic science had advanced dramatically since 1989. The Cold Case Unit focused on fiber analysis. Back in 1989, forensic fiber comparison was a relatively crude science, limited by the microscopes and analytical tools available at the time. But by 2021, microscopic fiber analysis had become far more sophisticated, allowing forensic scientists to identify and compare textile fibers with much greater precision. The investigators resubmitted evidence to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Laboratory, SLEDI, the state's premier forensic facility. They were looking for connections between the ligature believed to have been used to strangle Justin and the fibers found on his clothing. In a decision that would later prove controversial, the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office rehired the original detective who had investigated the case in 1989. He reviewed his old files, his old notes, his old theories, and he concluded that modern fiber analysis supported what he'd believed all along, that the parents were guilty. The fiber evidence, according to the new analysis, showed microscopic matches between fibers from a dog collar found at the Turner home and fibers recovered from Justin's shirt. This, investigators claimed, proved the dog collar had been used as the murder weapon. Combined with the circumstantial evidence, the lies, the staged scene, the opportunity, they felt they finally had enough to bring charges. On January 9, 2024, 35 years and 10 months after Justin's death, Berkeley County Sheriff Dwayne Lewis held a press conference. With television cameras rolling and reporters crowding the room, Lewis announced that Victor Lee Turner and Megan Renee Turner had been arrested and charged with murder in connection with Justin's death. "We got here because of new technology and forensic medicine," Lewis told the assembled press. "You all know how things have progressed over the years." He described Justin's death as a more tragic, horrendous murder, a 5-year-old boy. The implication was clear. Modern science had finally caught up with a case that 1989 technology couldn't solve. Victor and Megan Turner were arrested at their home and transported to the Hill-Finkla Detention Center in Berkeley County. Their initial court appearance was conducted via video, both defendants appearing on screen before a magistrate judge who explained the charges against them. Because murder is a capital offense in South Carolina, the magistrate couldn't set bond. That power resided only with circuit court judges. The Turners were held pending a bond hearing that might never come, facing the possibility of life in prison for a crime committed when Ronald Reagan was still president. But almost immediately, their defense attorneys began mounting a challenge that would prove devastatingly effective. Attorney Sean Kent, representing Megan Turner, filed a motion to dismiss the charges, arguing that 35 years between a crime and prosecution violated the defendant's constitutional right to a fair trial. The motion laid out a stark reality. Over 20 potential witnesses who had been alive in 1989 were now dead or medically unable to testify. Memories had faded. Physical evidence had degraded. The Turners couldn't effectively cross-examine witnesses who no longer existed. How do you defend yourself against accusations when the people who might have exonerated you are in their graves? The motion hearing in March 2024 revealed even more troubling problems with the prosecution's case. The new forensic evidence wasn't actually new. It was old evidence looked at in a different way. The dog collar that supposedly proved everything couldn't be produced in court. It had never been properly recovered, raising questions about how fiber analysis could be conducted on evidence that didn't exist. And in a bombshell that would become central to the defense, Sean Kent introduced an alternative suspect, Richard Mark Evanitz, a documented serial killer who had been stationed at a naval facility in Charleston at the time of Justin's murder. Evanitz had a confirmed pattern of abducting and murdering young victims. He'd been linked to murders in Virginia and a kidnapping in South Carolina. The FBI had even issued a directive in 2008 for law enforcement agencies to review unsolved crimes in areas where Evanitz had been stationed. But Berkeley County investigators had apparently ignored this directive, maintaining their tunnel vision on the Turners and never seriously investigating whether a serial killer might have been responsible. The courtroom testimony revealed something even more disturbing. The original detective, rehired to review the case, had changed his interpretation of evidence over the decades. What he'd seen one way in 1989, he now saw differently in 2024. A red flag suggesting bias rather than objective analysis. On June 7, 2024, Circuit Judge Roger Young issued his ruling from the bench in Berkeley County Court. The courtroom was packed. Media, family members, curious observers who had followed this case through its bizarre resurrection and rapid collapse. Judge Young's decision was unequivocal and damning to the prosecution. The charges against Victor Lee Turner and Megan Renee Turner were dismissed. But not just dismissed. Dismissed with prejudice, a legal term meaning the charges could never be refiled, could never be brought again, regardless of what future evidence might emerge. The door was permanently closed. Judge Young's written order laid out his reasoning with the kind of careful legal analysis that would make this case a precedent for decades to come. The 35-year delay between crime and prosecution, he ruled, had created substantial actual prejudice to the defendants, prejudice so severe that a fair trial was impossible. Over 20 witnesses who had been available in 1989 were now dead or medically incapable of testifying. The defendants couldn't effectively cross-examine people who no longer existed, couldn't challenge statements made decades ago by people who would never face questioning. Physical evidence had degraded or disappeared. Memories had faded to the point of unreliability. And most troubling to Judge Young, the original detective had changed his interpretations of evidence over time, seeing things in 2024 that he apparently hadn't seen in 1989, suggesting bias rather than objective analysis. The judge's order specifically noted that the prosecution had presented no truly new evidence. The fiber analysis was simply old evidence examined with different technology. Technology that, defense experts argued, couldn't overcome the fundamental problem that the actual dog collar had never been recovered and couldn't be produced in court. How do you prove fiber matches when you can't show the jury the item those fibers supposedly came from? Judge Young was also clearly troubled by the alternative suspect theory that had never been properly investigated. Richard Evanitz's presence in Charleston, his documented pattern of violence against young victims, the FBI's directive to investigate possible connections, all of it had been essentially ignored by investigators who seemed determined to prove the parents' guilt, rather than objectively pursuing all leads. The courtroom reaction was immediate and divided. Victor Turner, now in his 60s, his face weathered by 35 years of suspicion, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. "I feel like they did a very poor case from the beginning," he said, his voice carrying decades of frustration and grief. "I'm glad that it's over with, but now we really won't ever know too much. All I wanted was to get the person who did this." There was something heartbreaking in that statement, a father saying the investigation that had focused on him for 3.5 decades had actually prevented justice for his son, Megan Turner, who had lived more than half her life under a cloud of suspicion, spoke about the psychological toll. "It's been over 30 years. We couldn't say anything. The investigation, when it first started, everything went so wrong. If we said anything, they tried to twist it." Her words painted a picture of two people trapped, unable to grieve properly, unable to speak freely, unable to move forward because anything they said or did was interpreted as evidence of guilt. Sheriff Dwayne Lewis issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the dismissal but defending his department's efforts. Unfortunately, today charges Berkeley County Sheriff's Office brought against Victor Lee Turner and Megan Renee Turner in regards to the Justin Turner case were dismissed by a judge. Berkeley County cold case detectives work tirelessly to bring justice to victims and families. This is not the outcome we were seeking. However, we understand the technicality of prosecuting cases from crimes that occurred years ago. The word technicality was revealing, suggesting the sheriff's office still believed in the Turners' guilt, even if the law prevented prosecution. The Ninth Circuit Solicitor's Office, responsible for prosecuting the case, issued its own statement. Judge Young has upheld the oath of his office by following the law. As the testimony at the motions hearing revealed, the time that has passed since this despicable crime has resulted in witness testimony and evidence that is now unavailable. Furthermore, mistakes that were made 35 years ago could not be remedied. Even the prosecution seemed to acknowledge that the 1989 investigation had been flawed from the beginning, and so the Justin Lee Turner case ends where it began, unsolved. Justin would have been 40 years old in 2024. He might have graduated from high school, attended college, married, had children of his own. He might have been a teacher, a mechanic, a businessman, a father coaching his own son's little league team. Instead, he remains frozen at 5 years old, a kindergartner who never got to grow up, whose brief life ended in violence on a March morning in 1989. The real tragedy of this case isn't just that a child was murdered, it's that 35 years later, we still don't know with certainty who killed him. Were his parents guilty, freed only by the passage of time and the death of witnesses? Were they innocent, wrongly accused by investigators who locked onto suspects too early and ignored evidence that didn't fit their theory? Did a serial killer, now dead himself, his body cremated, his DNA lost to history, commit this crime while investigators focused obsessively on the family? Justin Lee Turner's killer walks free today, whether that person is Victor and Megan Turner or someone else entirely. And that uncertain justice or injustice is perhaps the most haunting legacy of all.